My name is Kendall Fortney. I run the open source program office at the University of Vermont. Welcome to our first gathering of the Open Source Connector. This is one of what we hope to be many over at least the next year as we figure this out. Openness is about sharing, maintaining, and building resources together. So that's kind of why we're all here, is we do that in some form as contributors, as maintainers, as creators of all sorts of things. And the goal is we're gonna have a series of talks that have those conversations about different ways you create, and also bring points where we can do workshops and do fun stuff together as well. This is new though. I'm an organizer inside of the Burlington Data Science Meetup. I've done other organizing. This is a little bit different because we're trying to do some activity things. So we'll see how that goes. For those that are online, we're trying to make everything work. Wi-Fi is a little bit weird. So hopefully you're getting, let us know if it's problems. And if you can mute yourself, that'd be great. So what do? So we were created very recently. We're trying to create a knowledge sharing around open source. This is actually because I was talking to a student and they were trying to do QGIS, which is GIS fun. And they were like, I don't know how to do this. And I'm like, I don't really know how to do it that well. Like, who else in this community actually knows these sorts of things? How do we provide those places to connect? And
I don't.
I talked to David and I talked to Jean-Gab, and we kind of realized there's a lot of opportunity to actually like bring people together because there's a lot of opportunities to do things with that. So I am Kendall Fortney. I'm at UVM. I run the open source data science. I run the open source program office. David is going to be presenting today. He is at Champlain College. He's a associate professor. Jean-Gab Young is a UVM professor who's also here. He's part of the group. And then Jonathan Ferguson is also part of the group as well. He's a Champlain professor. So we have kind of joint UVM Champlain mix, and we host these events ideally over the next year at both campuses to allow students from both places to actually come together. Our sponsor is the James Jeffers grant from UVM. They gave us the money to buy the pizza for those that are physically here. There's pizza here, as well as some of the costs for like getting a domain and that kind of stuff to set up things like that. So we're always going to thank them because that makes our life a lot easier to actually run these things. It does cost money, and we don't want to charge you for it. That's the end for me.
Okay. All right. So I'm David.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Jean-Gab and Kendall and Jonathan for organizing this. I'm David. I teach computer science at UVM, and thanks also to the James Jeffers grant for making this possible, right? I'm going to talk to you for the next probably 35, 40 minutes about open source licenses. And I'm also going to leave plenty of time at the end to take some questions as well. We'll go in some depth. For those of you, though, that already know a lot about this, there probably will be a lot of stuff you already know, but I'm hoping that there's some of you that this will be fairly new to, because I do have some kind of introductory type material as well. So one disclaimer I'll say right off the bat, that this is not legal advice. I will talk about some kind of legal terms. I'm not a lawyer, and you should take what I say with a little bit of a grain of salt. Because I'm not a lawyer. I am an open source project maintainer, and I developed our open source class at Champlain. But again, I'm not a lawyer. So if there's something that you have that's really important, it's like a tricky open source issue, consult one. Don't just go off of what we talk about today. So I want to start by posing the problem. The biggest problem that happens to somebody who's new to working with open source software is actually doing this. This is just a random that I found, I don't know, last night or something. And you can see here, there's no license file, right? And there's not even a README. That's bad too, right? But more importantly for our talk today, there's no license file, right? So what happens if somebody does this? If you went on this repository and you started using this code, what would happen to your responsibilities? What would happen in terms of how you might get in trouble if there's no license at all? And I'm just going to move these bars around because they're a little in the way for those who are in person. Where's my pointer? I'm just going to move this there. Okay. If there's no license file and we're in that situation, we actually, as somebody looking at the repository, have no rights. The original creator has all the rights. They own the copyright to all of their work as soon as they finished working on it. In the US and in most countries that have signed the Berne Convention, which is the vast majority of countries around the world, as soon as you finish working on a piece of source code, you own the copyright to it, actually. And so if you didn't grant other people rights with relation to it, they don't have it. the original creator, has the copyright. So just because they've exposed you to the source code doesn't mean you can actually do anything with it. So it's not open source. Just because you put the source code out there on GitHub, that doesn't mean it's actually yet open source. It's still just your copyrighted code that you've just made it possible for other people to look at. And that can really be a problem because you can get into some tricky situations. You go and start using that code now in your own project, incorporating it, and you're actually possibly infringing on the copyright. They didn't say that you could do that. Now, you could say that implicitly by putting it up, they want other people to look at it. That's not good enough. We need explicit rights about what we can do with various source code that we come across. So why I want to go back then to why we have copyright to begin with. So this is actually from the US Constitution. So we're going to kind of talk about like the basis of why we have all these laws and why we have, I'm just going to move these windows out of the way for the folks in the room. Why we have all these laws and why they exist. In the US Constitution, we, all the way beginning of the founding and the framers of the Constitution, they put in, not an amendment, in the actual original document, to promote that we would have laws related to copyright and patents to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times, we'll talk maybe more about that later, to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. So the purpose of it being in the Constitution, us having laws about copyright, was actually not for people to make money. It was for the public good. The reason we have copyright is for the public good. It's to encourage people to create new works. And by giving them an exclusive monopoly, we hope they're going to be able to profit off of them. But that's not the reason that we have the laws. We have the laws to encourage people to create new works. So copyright was actually like a very forward-looking set of laws. It was a set of laws that was related to encouraging good works to come out for the benefit of the public. Now, how do we go about doing that? The way we go about doing that is by giving people an exclusive monopoly to the rights to those works for what was supposed to be a limited amount of time. It was supposed to be a limited amount of time. Now, how limited actually is that time? I accidentally went to the next slide, and maybe a lot of you already know, but how limited is that time? Does anyone know?
Years.
How many?
80?
It's even more. It's even more. 95 years. So as soon as you finish writing a piece of source code, you own the copyright to it for 95 years. That's a really long time. Think about this. When the first software that is still being used was written in like the 50s and 60s, right? None of that software's copyright has yet expired. And the current law is 95 years or 70 years after you die. So it's 70 years after you die or 95 years, really long time. Now that's the law in the United States. The Berne Convention, which is the same that says, as soon as you finish writing something, you have the copyright to it. It says the minimum is 50 years. So anywhere around the world, any country you're in that signed the Berne Convention, which is like 170 countries, you at least own the copyright to it for 50 years. So very little software, almost no software, has its copyright yet expired, okay? And we have that copyright, again, automatically. Now, what happens if it did expire? If you did finish those 95 years or 70 years after your death, then the work would enter the public domain. Once it's in the public domain, anybody can do anything they want with it, like literally anything. There's absolutely no restrictions. For example, The Great Gatsby, sometimes considered one of the best American novels, right, is in the public domain now. It was written, I think, in 1925, something like that. So you can literally go and take The Great Gatsby, publish your own version of it, and make profit on it. And you don't have to give anyone any credit. You can just go and take The Great Gatsby and use the cover for your own artwork. The cover's out of copyright too. You can go and rewrite the novel and change some chapters. You don't have to even say it was written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I could take The Great Gatsby and write by David Kopec on it and publish it and not change any of the text, and that would be perfectly legal. Once something has entered the public domain, anything that you want to do with it can be done. So you might ask yourself, how is that different from open source software, right? Well, believe it or not, some open source software is in the public domain. For example, SQLite, the most popular database in the world, because it's just installed on the most things, is in the public domain. So it's actually, you can go and do anything you want with the source code to that database. And it's included on every Android phone, every iOS phone. It's bundled in Firefox, a lot of software products use SQLite, and they have the ability to just do anything they want with it. So SQLite is an open source piece of software that's in the public domain. But most of the time, that's not what people think about when they think about open source. Most of the time, the folks who create the original piece of software want to continue to be able to have some kind of credit attached to their creation. And that's basically the minimum that some open source licenses do. They at least allow you to keep getting some kind of credit for your creation. And we're going to talk about a few of the most popular licenses today. But all of these licenses, and basically every popular open source license, at least says two things. And I'm going to actually go forward and come back a little bit. The two things they all basically say is you have to give credit to the original creators. You have to say somewhere, hey, I got this from this person or this organization. And I'm not going to blame you if there's anything wrong with it. That's the credit clause and no warranty clause. No warranty clause says, hey, if I'm using this in a nuclear facility and the nuclear facility has an accident and it was because of that piece of software, I'm not going to blame the creator of that open source piece of software. Every open source license that's popular has these two clauses in it. But I want to now go back a little bit. So how do we get to that point? We actually started, before there was open source, there was, of course, free software. And the free software movement started in the early 1980s. Richard Stallman founded the GNU Project, founded the Free Software Foundation, created one of the most popular licenses, the GPL. And there had already been open source software before that. The BSD project had already started before that. There had already been academics sharing software very commonly. So there was already kind of a bit of a movement before the free software movement, but the movement got formalized as the free software movement in the early 1980s. And Stallman's defined for most intents and purposes, this is the definition, what free software is. And he had four things that free software must be. And therefore, any free software license must have these four things applied to it. And here are the four things. You have to be able to run the program however you want to. And he starts them at freedom 0. But when I was doing bullet points in Keynote, you can't start at 0. So it's freedom 1 here. Okay, run program however you want to. Freedom to study the program, how it works. And that implies you have to have access to the source code. How can you study something if you don't have access to the source code? So the source code access is actually implied in the second freedom. The freedom to redistribute copies. So after you have the source code, you can now give it to anybody else you want to. And the freedom to distribute your changes, your modifications. That's actually one of the most important ones. Is after you've gone and you've used the software, you want to make some changes, you can now go and give to anyone else those changes you've made. So that kind of perpetuates the whole idea of it being free software to other people. So those four freedoms are what define a license as being a free software license. If a license has all four of these freedoms, the Free Software Foundation will certify it and say it's a free software license. Okay, where does open source come in? The open source movement split from the free software movement in the late 1990s. And when they split, they mostly agreed on most things, actually. And so they had their own definition that they came up with called the open source definition that was based on an earlier definition from the Debian project. And it is maintained today by the Open Source Initiative, which is a nonprofit that maintains this definition. It's stayed basically the same since the 90s. I think they added one clause to it since the 1990s. And they are the ones who put the stamp of approval on a license for being open source. Now you might say, and we debated this in my ethics class, should a nonprofit organization get to define what a term is? Well, I think about it kind of like the American Dental Association. Okay, the American Dental Association is a nonprofit that goes and takes toothpastes and certifies them. It puts its stamp of approval and it says this toothpaste is ADA approved. I think of that similarly to what the Open Source Initiative does. They take licenses and they put their stamp of approval. Now, they can't go in your mind and make you think open source is the same thing that they do, but for the purposes of the industry, they are the certifying organization. They're the nonprofit. And they were founded, by the way, by a lot of the people who founded the open source movement. It's changed over time who the leadership is. Some of the early leadership was actually pretty controversial, frankly, but they're folks who are deeply dedicated, who run the Open Source Initiative to the open source movement. So they have their own definition. It's an evolution from the free software definition. And for a license to be open source approved, it has to meet these 10 criteria. And you can go on their website and read the details of all these 10 criteria. But I will point out that it is a more detailed definition, obviously, than the free software definition. However, 99.99% of open source software is also free software. And almost every license that is popular today is both a free software license as well as an open source license. So the two terms, even though they're part of different movements, and really the movements are a little different, for intents and purposes, most software that's open source is also free software, the vast majority, and most of the licenses are both. So I'm just gonna, there's a lot here. I'm not gonna go through all 10 of these, but I just wanna point out two of them that'll become important later in our discussion. Number 5 and number 6, no discrimination against persons or groups, no discrimination against fields of endeavor. There's some controversy around some recent licenses that we'll talk about a little later because they violate these two clauses. And so the Open Source Initiative, who came up with this definition, says that those recent licenses are not open source licenses because they violate these two clauses. But some large corporations believe, are still using the term open source, even though the Open Source Initiative doesn't agree that those licenses should be thought about as open source. So we'll get more into that a little later. So I do want to get into some of the specifics of some of the licenses, but I'll stop right here if there's any questions so far. No? Doing okay? All right. So we can take all of the open source licenses and divide them broadly into two categories: permissive licenses and copyleft licenses. Permissive licenses are not that far away from public domain, actually. They have those two clauses, all of them, that say no warranty and you have to give credit. And some of them have a couple additional clauses, and we'll talk about a couple of those later on. But basically, you can do whatever you want if you give credit. Basically, with most permissively licensed software, you can go take it, use it in your commercial project, not have to release any of your source code, and do basically what you want as long as you give credit for the most part. On the other hand, the copyleft licenses preserve the freedoms in a sense because they force you to have your modified version of their software under the same license. But at the same time, they're also forcing you, therefore, to release your source code as open source as well. Because that's why they're sometimes called viral licenses. Some people, in a more pejorative sense, think about them as infecting the other pieces of software that they touch. Because if you're incorporating a GPL, for example, which is one of the licenses that we're going to talk about, project inside your own project and using that source code and modifying it, you're going to now have to release all of your project as open source under the GPL license as well. And that's why it's called copyleft. It's kind of like flips copyright on its head by using copyright as a tool to spread a specific license. So we talked about no warranty and giving credit already. All of these licenses have them. And the most basic of these licenses is the MIT license. This is the entire MIT license. It's not very long, right? And literally all it says is those two things. It says you have to include this copyright notice and permission notice in any portions of the software that you include. And you can't blame the original creator for anything that goes wrong. So you can't sue them, basically. If I make my library, I release it under the MIT license, turns out it doesn't work very well, not my problem. You chose to use it. You knew this clause was there. You saw that in the license before you used it. It's your problem now, if there's anything wrong with it. I'm kind of doing it out of the goodness of my heart. I'm putting it out there. But I'm not saying that I'm going to be responsible for all of time for this project or for anything that goes wrong with it. Now, you might say from an ethical standpoint, maybe I should. But from a legal standpoint, I'm not taking responsibility. So the MIT license is really basic. And it's also one of the most popular licenses, despite being so basic. And how do you MIT license something? Like any of these, all you do is you put this notice in your repository, and ideally, actually in every source code file as well. So every source code file that I license on a project that's MIT, I actually just put this entire thing as a comment at the top of the file. And I'll mention a little later why that's important. Another permissive license, very popular, is the Apache license. It also has those two clauses, of course, that we've already talked about, no warranty, and also that you have to give credit. But it adds a few other things. It adds a contributors clause. What does that say? Well, what happens if somebody else contributes their source code to your Apache license project? Who owns that? Who's responsible for that? Let's take it back. Let's go back to an MIT license project. Someone contributes something to your MIT license project. What is their contribution licensed under? What do you think? So you have an MIT license library out there. Somebody sends you a patch, a pull request on GitHub, whatever. Their pull request, what's the license of their pull request? Yeah.
Should it also not be MIT?
You'd hope so, but it's a little ambiguous. Did they tell you explicitly it's under the MIT? Because remember, the second you write source code and you finish writing it, you own the copyright to it. So the person who was contributing actually owns the copyright to their contribution as soon as they finish writing it. And now they submitted it to you as a pull request. If you didn't explicitly have them sign something or online digitally sign something that says they're transferring the rights over to you, or they didn't explicitly say my contribution is under the MIT license, there's a little ambiguity there. And yeah.
Can you address the ambiguity? Also, like practically when you do a pull request, right, you need to push your code to a repo who's yours, which
Yeah.
will presumably still have the MIT license on it.
Yeah.
So it will never touch GitHub without having a license associated with it. That's
Right. Right. And so like if you're the original creator, it's obvious that like that's your intention, right? But this other contributor who's not part of the original project, what was their intention? Can we read their minds? Do we know that they read the license? Like there can be some legal ambiguities there. So it's better if we're more explicit. That's true with a lot of things we're talking about today. If we're just more clear about it, it's better. And so the Apache license adds in a contributors clause. It says explicitly in the original license, hey, if you go and contribute something to this, by default, we're going to assume your contribution is under the Apache license too. And that removes a significant amount of ambiguity. Even better is if we go even further and have them sign a contributors agreement, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but at least some of the ambiguity is gone with the Apache license. Other things it takes care of, state changes. So if you make a modification, the Apache license says you need to state what modifications you made. So if you continue to distribute the Apache license project on your own, and you took this original project and you've made some modifications, Apache license says you should actually write what all those modifications are that you've made. It doesn't have to be in excruciating detail, but there should be some mention you modified this file, and maybe for everyone's usefulness, put a little bit about what you did. And patent clause, I don't want to get too into this because I don't want to give you bad legal advice. I'm not an expert on it. But on the patent clause, sometimes you might make a contribution actually that involves some patents at your company. And we want to be sure if you're making that contribution, we have the right to use that contribution. And so the patent clause addresses that. Okay, so those are two popular permissive licenses. The MIT is super straightforward. Apache adds a few caveats that make it a little more interesting. Then we get to the GPL. The GPL is the most popular copyleft or viral license. And the most important thing you need to know about it is that if you take a GPL project and you go and modify it, you have to, or you incorporate it in your own project, you have to go and then release your code under the same license. That's what the GPL says. So you're going to have to go and also use the GPL license for your own code and make your own code open source as well. So you're kind of locking yourself into this, that you're going to, that if you're using this GPL library, for example, and you've modified a little bit, or you've actually incorporated it straight into your project without just using it as a binary, let's say, you are now going to have to release your source code as well. So that ensures that your project's open source too, but it also means that you can't not be open source in a sense, okay? The LGPL, which is also known as the Lesser General Public License, GPL stands for General Public License, is very similar, but it makes an exception. If you're just linking against the project, then you don't have to release your source code. So it allows libraries to be distributed that if they get modified, still need to have those modifications published as open source. But if the library is just being used as a library, just being linked against, then we don't have to release our source code and don't have to be released. Yeah.
How do you explicitly define link against?
Yeah, like a dynamic library. So like if something is, if you build something into a dynamic library and then you're just calling APIs in it, but you're not actually taking the code and putting it in, meshing it with your code, then this exception applies.
So there needs to be a clear separation.
There needs to be a clear separation. Absolutely. Yeah. So, this is the reason that the GNU project started with the LGPL, and then, it's been adopted quite widely, is to make it possible for commercial software to use certain libraries that are open source under a GPL-like license. That was the whole reason. It was to make it friendlier to proprietary software, actually, because they thought it was important that certain libraries that are free software libraries get adopted as widely as possible so that certain free software standards can be promoted. And so, yeah.
What are like
New utilities like GCC.
Sure. GCC is under the GPL. Yeah. And the Linux kernel is under the GPL, probably the most prominent GPL license project. But then certain libraries from the GNU project and from others too. I mean, anyone can adopt these licenses just because, you know, GNU project started these licenses. These are standard licenses that projects all over the place use. Linux obviously is not part of the GNU project, and it uses the GPL license. I should also mention there's different versions of the GPL license, and there's some differences between them. I thought I was a little into the weeds for today because I have a lot more general stuff to go through too. But if you want to talk about that at the end, I'm happy to go into that too. Okay, so we talked about how these viral licenses can kind of like pejoratively infect software, right? So some big companies don't like viral licenses. They don't like copyleft licenses. In fact, one of the what company do you think like really hates GPL software? Microsoft's not a huge fan. That's definitely not a huge fan. Yeah. They incorporate obviously like the Linux subsystem for Windows and stuff like that. There is some GPL software that they're shipping. Meta, yep, Meta's kind of not a big fan. Oracle, sure. And the one that I'm thinking about in this slide, and maybe some people picked up on it, is Apple. So Apple, when they shipped Mac OS X in 2001, actually had several pieces of GPL licensed software that was incorporated in Mac OS X, including the main compilers that developers use. GCC was the compiler for Objective-C in the early versions of Mac OS X. Over the last 20 years, Apple has been systematically removing every piece of GPL licensed software from their standard distribution. For example, even some silly things like Nano, Nano, the text editor, they went back to Pico. Because Pico was the permissively licensed forerunner to Nano, because that was just one example of where they're pulling it out. But the big example is GCC. So they use GCC as a compiler for Mac developers from about, Next had used it before that. Apple bought Next. And then from the early days of Mac OS X all the way to like 2008 or something, GCC was a standard compiler that developers used for their Objective-C, C++, and C code. However, Chris Latner was in university during that era, and he was working on the LLVM project. LLVM and Clang are the biggest open source competitor to GCC today, right? Apple sponsored most of that work after he graduated. They employed him, and they sponsored a bunch of other developers to build out LLVM. Now, did they build out LLVM because it's better technology? That's what they say, but it is probably, I don't know, I think it is. But at the same time, it's also permissively licensed. LLVM is licensed under permissive licenses, different parts of it. I think some of it's Apache, some of it's BSD. And that enables Apple to, again, extricate another GPL product from its distribution. They're afraid that they're going to accidentally get into some legal situation where one of their softwares is connected to one of their GPL projects, and they're going to have to like release some source code that they don't want to release. That's why they don't want any GPL software in there. Yeah.
How have they not released the source code for the Mac OS already today?
Well, they were using GCC as a binary, not as a fundamental part of the operating system. So you can take a binary and distribute it without. If you modified it, you need to release your modifications to that binary. So any modifications they made to GCC, they had to release those, absolutely. But if GCC is a separate project from, let's say, AppKit in Mac OS X, which is the main framework used for building Mac apps, right? If it's not touching AppKit in any way, it's just a separate binary, you don't have anything to release around AppKit. But yes, Apple contributed to GCC. Apple contributed to GCC for years, including greatly improving the Objective-C support of GCC. But then obviously now that they're in the LLVM camp, they don't contribute to GCC now for like 15 years. And they're one of the main sponsors along with NVIDIA and Microsoft of LLVM. Anyway, so you see how this really plays out. These licensing issues play out not just in small-time software, but in big corporate software as well. Here's a few other common licenses. I'll just briefly mention something about them. The BSD license is a little of an ambiguous term because there's more than one version of the BSD license. The two-term, sometimes called the two-clause BSD license, is very similar to the MIT license. The three-clause, there's more than one version of the three-clause, but the main version of the three-clause BSD says, in addition to no warranty and you must give me some credit, also says well, you can't use me to promote your product. So you can't say in the most 3-clause BSD versions that because you incorporated my great open source project, your project is therefore great as well. Okay, so I don't know, just a little addendum. There's some other copyleft licenses. The MPL, which is the Mozilla public license, is somewhere between a permissive and a copyleft license. It's not as broad as the LGPL, but it does have a copyleft term in it if you're specifically modifying the original software. And the AGPL is, think about the GPL, but what if we applied it not just to where you're incorporating the software, but if you're modifying it and using it in a server, you now need to release the code to your server product as well. That's basically what the AGPL says. So it says if you're connecting to it across the network, even if you're not distributing those changes, now you do need to distribute those changes just because people are connecting to it. So it's even a little more infective, you could say, than the GPL is, but to protect software that might be used in server type settings and not distributed as clients. Okay. Then we get to the controversial ones, okay? There is a class of licenses that have become more popular recently, especially amongst large corporations, that are not known as open source licenses by, let's say, the Open Source Initiative or the folks who believe in the open source definition, but are instead known as source available licenses. All source available means is exactly what it sounds like. You can see the source code. So any license where you at least have the right to see the source code is source available. But if it doesn't meet all the other criteria of the open source definition, it won't be thought about, at least by the Open Source Initiative and the people who agree with the definition, as fully open source. So there's been some really controversial recent examples of this. MongoDB, which full disclosure, I'm a stockholder in, it released a license, used to release under the AGPL actually. And they switched over to, I think it's the server-side public license. I forgot what the SSPL stands for. If someone knows, feel free to correct me. But the SSPL adds additionally to that if you're using it on the server side and you have any additional software that's not actually necessarily linked to it or not even necessarily like incorporates the source code, but just works together with it, you need to release that source code as well. Now, does anyone know why MongoDB did this? Do you know the story here? The story is they were trying to quash their competitors. MongoDB, they were releasing the main database product. That's what MongoDB mainly makes, a database product, a document-oriented database, under an open source license, the AGPL. But the way they were making money was by selling hosting. They host the database. They have a product called MongoDB Atlas, where you pay MongoDB to have a hosted version of MongoDB. But so were a bunch of other companies. A lot of big cloud providers were like, okay, it's open source, we'll just host it as well. And MongoDB was like, we don't like that. We want to make all the money on hosting it. So they changed the license to say, if you're hosting with it, any other software that you've made to maybe make management of the servers easier, the user interface for the end users easier, you need to release the code for all of those as well. Therefore, MongoDB can go incorporate that code if they want to, right? So the reason they modified the license was to attack their competitors. Now, there's many ethical sides to this. You could say on one side, well, they have the right to, and that's actually true. Legally, they have the right to. They have the right to change the license. If you have, and we'll talk about contributors and stuff in a couple minutes, but if you have the original rights, all the copyright to the original product, you can change the license at any time, of course. You can release something originally under a proprietary license, then open source it later on. You can release something under an open source license and then make newer versions of it proprietary. It doesn't change the license for the earlier versions you already released. So there's earlier versions of MongoDB under the AGPL, they're still under the AGPL, and people can still go and fork them and do whatever they want with them, right? But any versions they released after that, they can choose to change under a different license. And that's what they do with all their versions since about 2018 are under this more restrictive license. Llama 2, this is really recent, right? Llama 2 is a LLM model from Meta that is a competitor to GPT-4 or GPT 3.5 from OpenAI, right? The license is basically a permissive license except for one clause. It says in the license, no companies that have more than 700 million users may use this for commercial purposes. So why would Meta do that? Why do you think? Yeah. Right. They don't want Apple and Google and Amazon to use Llama, basically, right? Now, you might say, okay, this is one big company being at war with another big company. Why do I care, right? Let me give you a few different sides to that. One is it's a bit of a slippery slope, okay? And this is my opinion, okay? So this is not, this is not gospel, but my opinion is it's a slippery slope. You start to allow restrictions on one open source license and you make it more admissible to have restrictions in other open source licenses. Like how many of us would like it if we had a license that said, well, no companies above 100,000 can use it, right? With 100,000 users, maybe some of us work at companies with 100,000 or more users. Or how many of us would like it if the license said, no people of a certain political persuasion or in a certain country can use it. There are licenses like that, by the way. There's random licenses people have put out like that. We might not like that. So it's a bit of a slippery slope. Here's another ethical argument against it. Some of the best machine learning researchers in the world work at Google, work at Apple, work at Amazon. Now they can't collaborate with Meta for the progress of science on this open model. It's not open to them. Is it their fault that they happen to be researchers at Google? I don't know. But on the other hand, you might say, well, they're a big corporation. They own the model. They put the research and development dollars into it. They have the right to release it under any license they want to. And legally, of course, that's the case. But ethically, we could debate it. We could definitely debate it. So we talked earlier a bit about contributor licenses, license agreements. The best thing is to be, especially if your project's like really important or is getting a lot of traction, is to be really explicit about the folks who are contributing to your project and what their rights and responsibilities are as contributors and what you have ownership of. And so if you're a popular open source project, you might actually have every contributor sign a contributor license agreement digitally, usually, right? Saying your contribution is under the same license as the original project. And some of them go even further. They say you assign the copyright to the original project. In fact, the GNU project encourages this. They ask contributors to a lot of the sub-projects in GNU to assign the copyright through a contributor license agreement to GNU. They say the reason they want to do that is one, then they can defend it legally if they need to. And two, of course, if they want to update the license, make changes to it over time, by having full control, they can do that. So this is ideal if you want to protect yourself and you're running a fairly sizable project. You want to probably have some kind of contributor license agreement in place. If your project's small, I guess you might not worry about it as much, or at least you might want to use something like the Apache license that has a contributor clause in it if you're worried about this, right? Unfortunately, these legal things really do come up, especially when something gets more popular. Okay. So last thing I have is some best practices, but any questions about the general way that the licenses work that I can answer? Yeah.
What gives authority to the licenses? Why can't I make a PID license?
You can absolutely go make your own license. Now it'd be best if you consulted with a lawyer to make sure that it's really correct, but anyone can go write a license and include it in their project. Is that a good idea? Not really, because the popular licenses have been tested. So they've already been incorporated in a lot of popular projects. And so there's already been, especially in the GPL's case, there's been legal cases around it. Now, some of the other licenses are not as well tested, but in general, they've been vetted. The big popular licenses have been vetted by lawyers. They've been incorporated in a lot of existing projects. So you can have some certainty it's going to hold up. But if you go and just write your own thing, unless you're an expert in intellectual property law, it's very possible you'll make a mistake. And the other thing is these licenses are all approved by either the Free Software Foundation or the Open Source Initiative. So they're understood as free software open source licenses widely. If you go and make up your own license, it's very possible that people, because of the way you wrote it, won't consider it to be fully open source because they'll think it violates one of the clauses. So that's another reason to consider that. But can you? Absolutely you can. Anyone can go write a license. Anyone can go incorporate it. And you see that sometimes. There was a funny case a few years ago. I think it was somebody made their own kind of weird license that said, this project can't be used for evil. Anyone hear about this? Yeah. And that violates the open source definition because the open source definition says, let's go back, no discrimination against persons or groups. So you can't discriminate against someone who's evil. And it's not an open source license then, because who defines what evil is too? It's another slippery slope, right? You might say, these people are evil, other people will think different people are evil, right? So anyway, so the Open Source Initiative would not approve that license. And people got upset about it. And then this project actually became like super popular. And the person had a problem then, because now they had to go and get every contributor to sign saying, oh, I'm giving the rights over to this original leader of the project so they can change the license. This goes back to the contributor agreement thing. It's a mess. If you didn't do this ahead of time, and then later on you want to go back and make a change, you have to go find every person that ever contributed to the project and get them to say it's okay to change the license, because they have, they retain the copyrights to their contributions unless explicitly otherwise said. Yeah.
How explicit does this consent need to be? Can I just say like, hey, man?
Yeah, if it's written and stored in a public place, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to say for sure, but I think if it's written and said in a public place, you explicitly said, this is yours, I'm giving it to you and you can release it under the original license, that's fine. But it's better if you have a standard, legal text that everyone is agreeing to. But I've seen situations like that. I don't know if they've been tested in court, but I've seen things where people just like went back, reached out to a couple people because it was a small project and they were like, hey, is it okay if I relicense this? And they basically got emails saying like, oh, it's okay, you do that. But I don't know how that holds up. Yeah.
Are there particular licenses you recommend that have less headaches?
Yeah, I think this is my personal opinion, but I think the Apache license is a pretty headache-free license. It has the contributors clause in it. It has the patent clause in it. And these are mostly to protect you actually as the original open source creator of the project, right? And it still has, and of course it has a no warranty clause. Don't ever put anything out there without a no warranty clause. That would be a really bad idea, right? Because you're putting this out there and you could be saying in your marketing about the project, hey, this thing runs, nuclear facilities great, or you wouldn't actually say that. You write, this is a great like linked list implementation, right? And then somebody uses a nuclear facility, it doesn't work. And they're like, you said it was merchantable. You said it was usable as a great linked list and it had a bug and now, it exploded our nuclear facility. So don't use any license that doesn't have that. But all of them do, all the standard licenses do. Again, don't create your own license. But the Apache license I like because it has a contributors clause right in it. So you don't have to go think about putting in a contributor license agreement, especially if it's something smaller. Yeah, they're both really popular. I think I saw a stat that they're like neck and neck, Apache and MIT. They're both like really up there. So, I mean, any of them are a fine choice. And actually, it's a good segue. Thanks for the segue, actually, because I have this kind of best practices thing. The main thing I would say is choose a standard license. Don't go and make your own license. Don't go and use some weird license that only 5 projects are using. It's much better if you use a license that's been widely understood, widely tested, and that people know exactly what it means. So people don't have to go read your license to know what it means because they've already read it, because they've read it in a million other projects, right? The second best practice, have a license file, of course, it's obvious, right? But actually have a separate file in there that says what the license is. But on top of that, put something in all of your source files that says what license every source file is under. Why do you think that is? Why is that important? Why should every source file have it?
Somebody just grab the file.
Right. What if somebody just uses one file from your project, right? Yeah, that happens all the time. I've done that before, right? Like the Apache license comes with both the full text and then actually in the license, it has what you should include in your source files because the full text is too long. You wouldn't want to put that as a comment in every one of your files. And so this is a sample from one of my projects. I put that little text at the top of every one of my source code files because it's important that everyone knows if they get that one file, what are their rights? What are they allowed to do with it? If that's not in there and they get the original file and they never saw the original project because it got redistributed a couple times, all they can assume is that they have no rights. Because remember, you own the original copyright to everything you create. So if they don't know, the only thing they can assume is that they can't use it. Okay, because we own the copyright after we write something. Yeah.
Isn't there a breach for whoever distributed the code because they were supposed to distribute it?
Yeah, but I'm saying like if the original person never put the thing at the top, but they just put the license file in,
That isn't that your fault?
that might be the in-between person's fault, but it's also your fault too for never putting this in your original file. And I'm just saying like it's a good idea to always put it in the original file. But great point. Yeah, absolutely. So let's not get into those situations. Let's just always put this at the top. And the MIT license is so short, I just put it right in as the header in the top of all the files. Okay, last thing, if your project's like something super serious, okay, you're working for your company has authorized you to release some of your code as an open source project. you probably should go the full mile and have a contributors agreement to make sure that there's not going to be any lawsuits later. This person did, and now they're suing your company for its product or something like that, right? So contributors agreements generally a good idea. Yeah.
Question on
Oh, sure.
practice stuff. License, 2014 to 2019.
So if you make changes like this is a file I guess I last modified in 2019. If I make changes now in 2023, I'm going to change that date. And what I really should be doing, which is not good that I didn't do here, right? So I should actually be putting in each year that I made. So what about if you're just using a library? Those were best practices if you're creating a new open source project. But what if you're just the consumer of an open source project, which I bet is basically everyone in this room, because I assume most of you are software developers or work in software or do something related to software. Actually, there's a bunch of things you should keep in mind too. First is obviously you should know what the license is and know what your right to the license. So you should at least be familiar with what the license is and what you need to do in respect to it. Second thing is if you work at a company, check if your company actually allows it. We talked about earlier, some companies don't like GPL software, to check the licenses that their developers were including. So what open source components were they including in Photoshop? What open source components are they including in Illustrator? And they actually include a lot. So they didn't allow viral licenses. Adobe, for whatever project he was working on, didn't allow GPL licensed software for obvious reasons, right? Because they didn't want to get in the situation. So make sure your company's actually okay with whatever licensed software you're using. You should check with the legal department, especially if it's a larger company. Next thing, all of these licenses, everyone we talked about except public domain, requires you to give acknowledgement. You're not following the license. If you take an MIT licensed library and you put an app on the Apple App Store and you don't somewhere in your settings screen have, well, it incorporates this MIT product and put the MIT license there, you're actually not following the MIT license. I see that violation all the time. You know, you go and you open some apps, you're sure they're using some open source components and they don't have any acknowledgement anywhere, not even on their website. Then you're actually breaking the license. It's not asking you for much, right? They're giving you this free stuff. Here's this great free library that you can use however you want to. And the one little thing they're asking you for is give acknowledgement. If you're not at least doing that, you're not following the license. And so you need to have in like your about box. I actually have an example here. It's a little bit covered. This is from Keynote when I was making this presentation last night. And you can see Apple has a little button that says acknowledgements. You click on that in the about box, it opens up a 7-page PDF. In that 7-page PDF is all the open source licenses for all the open source components that Apple incorporated into Keynote. And it's a lot. And the licenses say, like the MIT license says, you don't just say, oh, use this MIT licensed software. It says, and we can go back to the text, we don't have to, but it says you have to put the whole license. You actually have to copy the whole text of the MIT license into your acknowledgement somewhere in your about box or something like that, or your settings screen. That's what you're supposed to do at least. Then the last thing is, even if something's open source, it doesn't mean it doesn't have other intellectual property entanglements. It might have patent entanglements, right? It might have trademark entanglements. Maybe you're familiar with the free software version of the Firefox web browser. I think it's called like Iceweasel, right? Why did they rename it Iceweasel? Because Firefox is trademarked by Mozilla. So they had to rename it, right? So an open source license gives you rights with relation to copyright, but it doesn't necessarily give you rights with relation to trademarks or patents. And it'll depend. Some licenses do and some licenses don't. So you need to be careful about that as well. So incorporating an open source project is easy to do, but it comes with a few rights, that we still need to be aware of and responsible to. Okay, that's everything I have. I hope that was somewhat informative. Is there any questions I can answer? Yeah.
So I seem to recall that there are some open source licenses which have clauses prohibiting military use.
Yeah.
And things like that.
Mm-hmm.
How common are those clauses? And how is that different than the Llama 2 license, like saying?
Yeah. Great question. That is not an open source license by the open source definition. They're not very common. I have seen them. But that violates clause 5, no discrimination against persons or groups. The military is a person or group. No discrimination against fields of endeavor. Military is a field of endeavor, right? Violates both of those. So yeah, those are not open source licenses by the definition of open source, according to the Open Source Initiative. We might disagree. Some people might think open source should be more broad term. But if we're going by this definition, they're not. They're not very common, but they're becoming more common. And that's kind of where the controversy is right now around these really prominent examples, the MongoDB example, the Llama example, is that we're seeing this more and more. But they are not still the majority. They're not even a large minority. They're a tiny percentage. And what we're seeing most actually, you'll see the oddball kind of like, lone or small group that has an open source project that does something like that. But where we see this a lot more aggressively being violated is by large corporations. And they're not doing it because they're like, out of the goodness of their heart, they're doing it to try to stab their large competitors, in my opinion, at least. They're mostly, not following explicit open source licenses because they want to stop their competitors from being able to use their software. Sorry, yeah.
If someone does do something like that and it's not open source, what would it be called?
Source available is a term that is most prominent amongst the people who believe in like the open source definition. So something that's doesn't meet the open source definition, but has the source code available and maybe violates like some of the clauses of the open source definition is generally called by them source available. That said, reasonable people can disagree. Not everyone thinks that the open source initiative should have a monopoly on what it means to be open source. And so you might in your own mind think that the Llama license should still be considered open source because it's in the ethos of what you believe the ethos is. So we all can have our own values and our own ethics around it, right? But formally, in terms of the open source definition and the open source initiative, it would not be considered an open source license. It would be considered source available license. Yeah.
How is this enforced?
By the legal system. So there have been lawsuits to enforce open source licenses. It's hard to enforce. So if you're like some random person publishing some project and someone like uses it and you don't like the way they're using it, you have very little power to actually go enforce them.
Specifically, so you can take piracy in films, like you're not allowed to show it
Right.
to a private audience and ask money, but you still do it.
Yep.
How do I know that Meta doesn't run on open source software that they just put behind it?
You have no way of knowing that. Yeah.
Is this a sustainable model?
Well, that's a great question. I think that it is obviously already been around for 30 plus years. And so it's enabled an ecosystem of collaboration. But is it based somewhat on the goodwill of the people in it? Yeah. In fact, you could say from that standpoint, it's actually a wonderful story that it's worked as well as it has, even though there's tons of people who violate it all the time. I can tell you several interesting stories where people have violated it and there's no recourse to do anything about the violations. I know this guy who developed an open source chess product for playing chess online, and a corporation, small corporation, like a couple people, went and literally just rebranded it. It was GPL licensed, the original version, and they didn't release any of their source code. This happened in Israel. They had a lawsuit. They actually won the lawsuit, but it cost them more money on the lawsuit than they got in damages. And so it was not a happy story, right?
How did they find out they were using their software?
It was obvious. It was like, it was almost identical, right? But there are other ways we can do decompilations. There are ways, that we can decompile something using something like Ghidra and see what are the debug symbols inside of it. But is it possible for someone to like change all the names, change the instructions enough that it's impossible even with decompilation to be 100% sure? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. People violate these all the time. It's very common. And there's not a lot of recourse unless you're a big corporation with a powerful legal team. But despite all of that, we have this beautiful ecosystem that's enabled some of the most incredible software that we use today and underlies all large corporations incorporate open source software. Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, their products have tons of open source libraries in them. And all those companies, to their credit, contribute to open source as well. So we have this wonderful collaborative ecosystem, despite the fact that it's so hard to enforce. So we can flip the story either way. We can say it's super hard to enforce and there's nothing we can really do if we're a small developer, and and we don't have a lot of funds. But on the other hand, look at what has come out of this. And the world before this world was all proprietary software, pretty much, right? There was academics doing open source. There were some smaller projects like the BSD project in the early 80s and onwards, right? But the flowering of this has really been the last 25 years, and it's led to just an incredible amount of innovation and development, right? So we could look at it either way, but you're right. It's very hard to enforce. Yeah.
I guess thinking of proprietary software works, incorporating like media or large data sets where that information and the intellectual property is kind of virtually defined. I think in software works where data is made available has changed recently, or I'm thinking of organizations like Hugging Face, where data sets and core code are jointly present, and we have the Creative Commons, which some licenses are available for commercial use and some are not.
Yeah.
This is reflected in how, I guess, the evolution of the open source community.
So that's a big area of further kind of legal research right now. There's a lot of exciting machine learning models that are built out of large data sets. Does the machine, and that's being tested in courts right now as well, right? What is the responsibility if it's under an open license to the original copyright holders? I think that's an evolving field. I don't think we have any clear guidance yet from our court system. I will say, just as a side note, not all of these licenses are appropriate for all kinds of digital media. So for, like you mentioned, Creative Commons, if you're doing something like releasing an image data set or documentation, you should be using a Creative Commons license, not a software license, because a lot of the terms in the software licenses are specific to software, right? For example, even the GNU project, they don't release their documentation under the GNU license. They release their documentation under the free document license, I think it's called, or something like that. So we should use the appropriate license for the appropriate kind of media. And that's actually, even some people are saying, like, why did they release Llama 2 under an Apache-like license? Maybe they should have used more, something that's more tailor-made for a model. So it's an evolving area. I don't have any answers, but I think we're going to see quickly, because there's a lot of people who are really upset about it, that this will work through the court system over the next year or two. Yeah. Go to the back since we haven't gone there. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Sure.
First is sort of just an extension, and they may not be free to answer, but is there sort of consensus among the open source community about like the use of generative AI in your coding practices?
No, I think that's part of this. That's just evolving right now, and there's varying opinions on it, and we don't know how well these licenses will hold up in court in relation to these models. And I wouldn't want to comment and say something wrong about it, because I don't know what the opinion, I don't know if there's been surveys.
Well, most of the large Microsoft GitHub, and I think it was Amazon just recently, or Google, just said they would pay for all lawsuits related to code generated by.
I think I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're fairly confident that they're not breaking anything.
Right.
But they also have a lot of resources, so some of them are wrong.
Yeah. If I was doing a startup, I don't know if I would be, confident. So I'd be, it's very different. Like we were talking about this stuff earlier, right? It's so different being like Microsoft and having a huge legal team and unlimited billions of dollars to defend yourself versus being like, a lone developer or a small company, right? Yeah.
My second question relates to the credits in scientific work.
Mm-hmm.
So we use a lot of open source code for analysis, for visualizations and whatnot. To what degree do we need to credit work in a kind of paper?
I think, anytime you're writing doing anything academic, when in doubt, cite, so I would always err on the side of putting a little acknowledgement in somewhere in your paper. That said, I'm not an expert on that, so I don't want to give you wrong information. Yeah.
There's a huge movement to try and make more citations in publications for use of open source software. It helps funding the open source software, make it sustainable so it can be used for future research. But the follow-up question, are there any licenses that have, like, if you use this in scientific research that results in a patent or a product, IP?
I haven't seen that. These licenses don't say that explicitly. GNU Parallel?
Parallel, yeah.
Okay. That's cool. So it's out there. Yeah.
And also, are there any conversations that are looking to completely supplant the system of licensing, maybe going back and acknowledging that the 300-year-old model of copyright doesn't really work anymore. We have technology that could do some other stuff a little better.
Well, you know, a lot of people feel that way. Yeah, I don't know if a lot of people, but there's definitely a set of folks that feel that way, including Richard Stallman himself. You know, he's not that I'm like a huge, although he stayed at my house a few years ago. We had him at Champlain to give a talk, and he was there for a week, and it was a very interesting experience. But he himself does not believe that the current copyright system makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think most reasonable people don't think 95 years makes any sense. So should it be that we have the existing system? I mean, the existing system has led to, I mean, we can't deny it's led to a lot of great artistic works and scientific works over the last 200 years. At the same time, in 95 years, personally, is my personal opinion, is insane, right? So should it be the existing system and it's only 20 years? Should it be, you know, a totally new system? Definitely, there's a lot of debate around that. Stallman himself, here's his idea. He says, let's try a shorter term, see if it benefits society. Because remember, the original reason it's in the Constitution is not to actually make people a profit. The original reason it's in the Constitution is to promote the progress of science and useful arts, right? So would 20 years be doing that? Let's try it. That's his idea. And if it is, let's try 15, and then let's try 12, and let's see how that works out. And then when we find the perfect balance between giving people enough of an incentive to want to make new works and giving the benefits back to society, right? Let's stop there and let's find where that is. I don't think anyone who's reasonable, and this is my personal opinion again, because maybe there are reasonable people who think that way, but I don't think anyone thinks 95 years is striking the right balance. 95 years is extreme. I mean, right? And who keeps pushing it is like Disney, right? People all know that, right? Disney famously like pushes to extend copyright terms throughout the 20th century and try to stop anytime anyone wants to decrease them.
When it says normal expire, it's pretty sad.
Yeah, so they'll be pushing again in Congress, right? They'll be 95 isn't enough. It should be 110 and it should be retroactive. Right?
It's just hilarious because everything shows those fairy stories because everyone's going to copyright on those two versions of it. And he's like, yeah, just take it.
But you know, think about it from the other perspective too, right? Think about like as a developer, a software developer, right? Copyright does protect you to some extent as a lone small developer, right? As a book author, I'll tell you, copyright gives me an incentive. I'm working on my 5th book right now. I don't think I would have written the first one if copyright didn't exist. The profit motive, it does incentivize me. It's not the only reason I write books, but it's an incentive for me. And there's a lot of people like me out there, I think, who the profit motive is an incentivizing factor for them, whether we like it or not, right? So I think there's a balance to be struck there between what's good for society and what still encourages people who are motivated by profit to want to write new works, create new software, create new books, etc. Right? Yeah.
This might be a stupid question, but is there a way to write a clause or something where you publish something, but then after like 30 years?
Great question.
Goes
Yeah, that is actually a thing. And there was a company called Aladdin Systems in the 80s and 90s who published basically all their products under such a license. So basically what the products are proprietary for the first, I think in their case, 6 years, and then automatically become released under open source licenses after 6 years. So that is one of the many possible open source business models. Well, the original license is not, but once the 6 years happens, then it becomes open source.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, there are, you know, a lot of ways, of course, to profit off of open source products. And something important to mention, none of these definitions, the free software definition or the open source definition, say you can't sell. Okay, none of them say anything about money. It's free as in freedom. They always say like free as in speech, not free as in beer, right? You can sell, I can take right now, I can go and take any open source project, repackage it and sell it if I want to, right? There's nothing in these licenses against selling. They're not against commercialization. They're against proprietary code. They're not against commercialization of open source or free software code. And so there are plenty of open source business models. If you're interested in that, the best book on that probably is The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It has a chapter in it on, you know, all the different open source business models. And that was written in the late 90s, early 00s, and they've evolved and there's newer ones as well. But we all use, you know, products that are released under, like, anyone use JetBrains, like IDES, right? They have a base community edition that's completely open, right? And then they have professional editions that you pay for with additional features. That's one very common model. You know, of course, there's many, many different possible models. Yeah, sorry.
Are you saying that anyone could take my MIT code and package it themselves?
Absolutely, yeah,
But as long as they give credit.
as long as they give credit, but they don't need to release the code. If it's MIT, it's permissively licensed. They can do whatever they want. They can go take your MIT code. And by the way, they do it all the time. I have this, the one I gave my example of, this is my most popular open source project. It's called Swift Graph. It's a graph data structure for the Swift programming language. And I happen to know that it's been incorporated in commercial software that has millions of users. I'm not getting any money out of that, okay? And they're not even having to release their source code because it's a permissively licensed project. So the Apache License permissive. They just have to give me credit somewhere in their about box, somewhere in their settings screen, right? So yeah, you release something to the MIT license, people can do whatever they want with it as long as they give you credit. Yeah.
You regret that license?
No, no, I don't regret it because first of all, it's not something they couldn't have done themselves. You know, it's not like it's so sophisticated and other people contribute. It's not just me, like I'm just the person who started it. But you know, it's not something they couldn't have done themselves, but I get something else out of it, right? Which a lot of people get out of doing open source. I get name recognition, right? I get to put this, you know, there's a few people who know me as a result of this, right? It helps me in my career, right? Doing this. And it's kind of cool, right? Before the open source movement and the internet existed, there's no way that I would have gotten something like this incorporated in some commercial project, right? So this, again, open source is an enabler of collaboration. We might not always like the way people use it, but we're still enabling collaboration by putting it out there. Like, would I be telling you this story if like somebody I really don't like had incorporated it? Probably not, but I run that risk. Okay, I'm always running that risk. But yeah, sure, yeah.
Do you know of any licenses that have clauses where it's kind of the opposite, like the Llama one, where instead of if you have 700 million more users, you can't use this, where anyone can use this, but you pay per user. So if you have one user, you pay 1/20 of a penny. If you have 100 million users, you're paying $10,000.
Yeah. So that would not be an open source license by the open source definition. Again, if there's any kind of restriction one way or the other on who can use it or based on their size or how many users they have, that would violate a couple of those. So it wouldn't be an open source license, but a source available license like that, I'm sure must exist. And somebody mentioned Unity, right? Of course, are parts of Unity open source? I don't even know.
I don't think so.
No? Well, they do that kind of per model, but yeah, I'm sure that must exist. I'd be surprised if it doesn't. Yeah. Remember, there's millions, literally millions of open source projects. So anything you can imagine that somebody has modified the license somehow, it probably exists. Again, is modifying it a good idea? I don't know. You know, I ran into when Mongo I told you I'm a Mongo stockholder. I was at PyCon in 2018, and that was when they were making this change. And I went to the Mongo booth just because I was curious and I used the product myself. And I was talking to them and I was like, hey, you know, what's been the feedback for y'all around this license change? And he said, well, our shareholders are happy about it, but, you know, but the community is not, right? Do I blame the business? I mean, it's still more, this is like playing devil's advocate here, okay? But it's still more open than like Oracle database, okay? Like it is their product. And if they want, you know, I think it's within their rights to do it. Would I have done it? Probably not, right? Probably I wouldn't want the bad will that would come from the community as a result of doing it. But if I'm looking at this from a purely like, is this better, like comparative, you know, relational perspective than what a lot of proprietary companies are doing? Yeah. I mean, I still think it's better because at least I can inspect the source code and make sure that there's nothing that's going to hurt me in the source code or no spyware in the source code or anything. There's still benefits if something's source available. But, you know, it breaks the ethos. It breaks the ethos of the open source movement.
Thank you for all the awesome questions too.
Yeah.
That's why we're doing this. So thank you all for attending today. For everyone online, thank you as well. We'll be doing another one, hopefully in about a month's time. I'll announce that soon. And I'll try to push it out through network so people find it and are aware of it. Those are in session. Please, like those here, take all the pizza. There's no way I'm taking any of that home.